Hello and welcome to episode 5, Civil Rights and Libertarians. I am your host, God's gift to libertarian women, Dan Hill, and this is the one, the only, the Gold Kulak podcast. So this week, a lot's going on. I'm not going to do a lot of newsy stuff today just because you're probably hearing newsy stuff everywhere, but there is something I think it's super, super interesting we're going to talk about, and that is how libertarian ideals have done a lot for civil rights. And I actually started writing this as a different spin, and I just came to this conclusion within the last, as I was putting together the show notes here. But before we get there, I want to start off with welcome. If you are from TuneIn, I just got added to TuneIn, the podcast on TuneIn now. I also started posting to YouTube, so if you go to youtube.com, you can search for Gold Kulak, and you will be able to listen to these podcasts there. I'm not doing a video podcast yet, or like a simulcast deal, or simulcast type deal. But I hope to do that in the future. I got a lot of plans and a lot of things I need to get done before I can get to that. The second social media thing I started this week was I actually started a Twitter. So now if you disagree, if you like something, if you want to tell me I'm doing a great job, if I'm doing a terrible job, if you want to recommend something we could talk about, or maybe if I go more in depth to something else, you can hit me up on Twitter now at Gold Kulak. So I'm on Twitter at Gold Kulak. I only got like 14 followers right now, and like only 2 of them are real people. One of them is my personal account. You're free to add my personal account as well, at Dan Hill Ida. I don't do much with it, but I might start here in the future. So first off, a little previous business is we had the ceasefire in Baltimore. If you remember, it's on pace to become the deadliest year in Baltimore in decades. 2 people were killed over the course of this, or at least on Saturday, I believe. So that part failed. I'm still okay with this as a community coming together and trying to solve a problem and get a desired outcome, especially since their police are busy trying to figure out how to work their body cams, and so that way they're not showing them planting drugs on people. So, yeah. It's also still an excellent point of what the war on drugs has been doing to America. Feel free to go back and listen to episode 4 if you have not. Also, you've heard it, I'm sure. It's been everywhere. I'm not going to talk about it. I just had a couple of quick little points that I did want to bring up. I'm not going to go into like great deal in depth, but Trump's fire and fury speech. First off, relax. In the words of Aaron Rodgers, RELAX. Relax. We're not going to war anytime soon. Now, I do believe it's obviously still on the table. I think it's a very good possibility. I think we have a better chance of going to war with North Korea than we do escalating and having troops on the ground in Syria. And that's the point that was my stance on it back this spring when our military launched cruise missiles at Syria. I think we have a better chance of actually going to war with North Korea, but we just got these sanctions passed, and so I don't know if the world is ready to jump on board with a war so soon after we just passed those sanctions. You also have, I'm sure as you heard, North Korea isn't going to, if they're a cornered animal, they're going to lash out, and the victim's going to be South Korea. They're going to obliterate Seoul, because we would beat them. I mean, there's probably only 2 countries in the world, if we fought them one-on-one, that would have a chance against the American military. We've spent a lot of money and a lot of time on it, and there's very few countries that can withstand that. Now, if there's a coalition, that's a completely different deal, but I guess we're dealing in hypotheticals, so fair point. And I think the most important the most important aspect of whether or not we go to war is going to be, where do Russia and China stand? Like, what side would they be on? The first Korean War, they're actually both on North Korea's side. Like, we actually engaged with some Russian jets during that time, but both countries didn't want to make that statement publicly because of the escalation. There was already tensions there, obviously, and they didn't want to escalate things. So anyways, those are my thoughts on war with North Korea. I don't think you have to start worrying about whether or not you or your son or anyone's getting drafted. But yeah, so last time when we were talking about the war on drugs and the ceasefire in Baltimore, I brought up that it is impossible, you just cannot legislate morality. And I was wanting to expand on that example this week, and so that's what I started doing. I started to expand on my African American example, the civil rights example that I used last time. And as I was doing that, I thought, wow, you know what? It really was a movement about liberty. I mean, obviously, that it sounds kind of dumb coming out of my mouth like that, but as far as now, the identity politics and any sort of social justice type stuff kind of falls on the Democratic side, where they're wanting more social programs, this and that. African Americans just wanted freedoms. They wanted liberty. They wanted natural rights during what the period of time we refer to as civil rights, and specifically in the 1960s. And there's been a lot of legislation that was passed that didn't help. And I'm going to get into this legislation. Now, you will notice, and I'm only going to bring up one, but there's a lot of, and I will give you this point, that there's a lot of Supreme Court decisions that do help or come down in favor of African Americans. But I'm going to counter your argument well, that's government helping, but that is the one part of government that's essentially negative rights. Their whole job is negative rights for the government. That the most important thing they do is tell the government what they can't do, what they're not allowed to do constitutionally. So that makes a lot of sense as to why that would help someone trying to secure liberty, is the Supreme Court, which is giving the government negative rights as opposed to the positive rights the government normally tries to take. So let's get into it. So basically, we have the Civil War. African Americans get officially freed in 1865 by the 13th Amendment. Guarantees that there's no slavery. Slavery is not allowed in America. 1868, the 14th Amendment gets passed, and essentially the 14th Amendment guarantees African Americans and everybody really their rights under the law. Because what you saw was in 1865, actually there's a lot of parts of the South during this time that there's very, very high African American populations, almost higher than the white populations. And so you actually had African Americans, they got elected to state governments, and all throughout government, there's African Americans being elected. And of course, this is where positive rights come in. And it's a misnomer because generally positive rights are bad. Well, not necessarily always bad, but basically governments start passing Jim Crow laws, and you have the freak out of the Ku Klux Klan, or the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, excuse me. And yeah, so they start getting their rights taken away. So in 1868, the 14th Amendment's passed, because obviously just being free and not a slave doesn't guarantee your rights. So they have to pass the 14th Amendment. And then in 1964, we finally get that Civil Rights Amendment passed. However, the Civil Rights Movement did not end there, and injustices did not end there. After all that legislation, and even Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, that failed in some ways because You have the integration of Little Rock, Arkansas in 1958. Basically, they took 9 African-American children, sent them to an all-white school, and I'm sure if you've looked into the history of it, you know there's a ton of hubbub that surrounds that. The National Guard was called, the kids were threatened, and it only lasted 1 year. Like, they went to school for a year, it was this big to-do, and then they went back to an African-American school, or moved away just because, you know, it was not safe to continue. And schools were still integrating, even though we have this ruling in 1954, schools are still integrating in the 1970s. And actually, while researching this episode, I came across May of last year, 2016, where there was a school in Mississippi that was being forced to integrate because all the African Americans lived on one side of town, all the white people on the other side. So even though it wasn't like institutional, like socially, it was just done that way, and the school was kind of like making some attempts about trying to get kids to go to different schools, but they couldn't get them to cross railroad tracks. So, I mean, it's still happening today. And that phenomenon that I was referring to, where you end up with one side of town that's African American and the other side that's white, was known as white flight. It's why African Americans ended up in the inner cities, and, you know, like why there's a high percentage of African Americans in inner cities, and because the white people were racist or, you know, didn't like living that close to African Americans, or for many other reasons, they moved out to suburbs and so on and so forth. So I hope what I was able to argue there, and what you can get out of that, is even though we have all these laws passed, we have to keep passing laws, because even after the 13th Amendment, people don't start like saying, okay, you know, maybe we should start treating black people a little better. The 14th Amendment, people go, maybe we should start treating black people a little better. No, they keep passing Jim Crow laws and denying African Americans their rights. You have Supreme Court rulings, Brown versus Board of Education, that there's still government decisions being made today because of that ruling, and it should have went away fairly quickly, just saying, all right, you can come here, you can go there. So you can't legislate morality away. What had the biggest impact on African American rights were the protesters. And this is what would happen this is what happens in civil society. First off, African Americans shouldn't had to have go through all, because just remember the reason why they're being denied, and they shouldn't have had to go to all this trouble just to secure basic rights such as the ability to vote or to eat in a restaurant or so on and so forth. And my last point, the eat in the restaurant, that's fine if you want to discriminate, but they had a very good comeback for that. We'll get into that in a second. Anyways, so they shouldn't have had to do that, because let's not forget, it was Jim Crow laws that were passed. It wasn't necessarily social or cultural. It was, and it stems from those things where people didn't necessarily like African Americans or had some sort of a racist view, and so they would go and they would pass laws. And this is why you have to be careful with governments, because this is tyranny, that there's people still alive today that experience this tyranny. And this is why the Bill of Rights is so important, because it's that First Amendment, your free speech. That's what started changing people's hearts and minds and getting people to think about liberty in a different way for these African Americans. It wasn't passing the laws. It was the images that came up on television sets of buses burning or people being beaten because they were just trying to ride on an integrated bus across state lines. It's called the Freedom Rides. You had sit-ins at the lunch counters. So, like, for example, a modern like correlation, I guess, would be like the cake bakers and whether or not a religious cake baker would be allowed to bake a cake for a gay wedding. First off, libertarians would believe that, yes, you have that right. But what would happen is exactly what was happening with the sit-ins at lunch counters, where basically You had, it was Woolworths was the biggest known one, where they wouldn't serve African Americans, and so you started having African Americans that would show up and sit down, and once again you'd have these violent images. Of them getting drug out or getting squirted with ketchup and mustard, and just incense these people that genuinely were racist. These weren't microaggressions or anything like that we're supposedly fighting today. But so you had sit-ins at lunch counters. You also had, and they got this idea and they used it during the 1960s, but they reused a lot of ideas they had earlier in time, because the civil rights movement kind of comes in waves, just like rights for African Americans kind of came in waves, where they'd gain something and lose something, as they would protest it. And so they had don't buy where you can't work boycotts during the Great Depression. So essentially, African Americans they weren't allowed to work in certain establishments, and to be able to get back at these establishments, they started spreading around, hey, just don't buy things there. We'll boycott them. And it ended up gaining African Americans jobs. They were able to organize in civil society without the government. This was not the government forcing people to give people jobs. This wasn't the government forcing Woolworths to serve African Americans. It was civil society organizing and protesting, and either they lost money or it just started to become publicly shamed, I guess, that they were able to gain more rights for themselves. And it works for other groups too. The 1970s had like in the 1970s, homosexuals had kiss-ins, which, they would go and sit in and I assume kiss and make out and stuff at businesses that were homophobic or didn't serve or hire or whatever gay people. And yeah, so this is a perfect example about how, first off, government causes tyranny. We don't think of the United States as being tyrannical. Well, for a very large part of the time, and I don't care which side of the aisle you are or how you feel about social justice warriors now or anything like that, there is tyranny against African Americans. There was. There were in the early 20th century. I mean, there was literally like lynching parties where there would be lynch. The juries were essentially rigged that, innocent young men were killed or worse because they did something somebody didn't like. I forget the name, the young man that wolf whistled at a white girl ended up getting killed over it. So there was real tyranny there, and they were able to fight it, and they were able to do so with liberty. So essentially, the civil rights movement and the protests and free speech worked to gain them their rights. And it's a great example about how civil society works, where it's a scary thought to think like, well, what would we do if the government didn't help us? Well, we can help ourselves. We can organize, just like what the people in Baltimore tried to do, what the civil rights people fought for forever. And anyways, I just thought that's super interesting. And essentially, I don't know why any African Americans wouldn't want to be libertarians at this point. Because if we lived in a libertarian society where government was extraordinarily limited, then you wouldn't have Jim Crow laws in the first place, and they would be able to have skirted around a bunch of it. I think racism still would have persisted. It still persists in some form or another today, but I mean this is once again, case in point, and I'm sorry for going rambly again, but case in point that libertarian works, civil society is possible, and government does more to take away your rights than it'll ever solve. You cannot legislate morality. And this is case in point. African Americans, through protesting, were able to change hearts and minds. All the government did was pass amendments and laws that Didn't do anything other than help the Supreme Court a little bit here and there. Anyways, thank you so much for tuning in. Please subscribe. If you go over to, you can subscribe on YouTube. I'm on iTunes, Stitcher. I'm trying to get everywhere. Please, if you like what I said, if you agree, if you think I'm totally off base, if I was way too rambly, or you just want to say hi, please get on Twitter right now. Follow me at GoldKulak and tweet at me. I'd love to hear from you. And have a great rest of your week. Remember, new episodes drop every Tuesday and or Thursday. Sorry, this is another Thursday week. Have a great rest of your week.